Let me come on to some areas where I think it relates to this, or where sustainable livelihood thinking in that broad sense got stuck in the last decade, and point to where a few areas where I think livelihoods perspectives, despite all their strengths, which I don't want to undermine, have failed to have substantial purchase. And why we need to think about that if we're committed to livelihoods approaches as cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary, field-based, context-informed, and so on. I think one story which has been documented by others is the story of that framework, and I think Jane and Diana will talk about it, well, Diana in absentia will talk about it this afternoon in respect of DFID. But there were a lot of frameworks around in the late 1990s, and they all had different looks and different levels of effectiveness of computer graphics. You can see how basic we were at IDS in those days. It would all be colourful and with complicated arrows these days. But anyway, it was rather elementary. But there were a lot of them, and it did to some extent provide, in the terminology that we use now, a community of practice, a discourse coalition, a sense of common vision around a set of ideas and a set of principles that had some political and policy purchase. But where did it fail? And the failures are not complete, but where in retrospect, in hindsight, did it fail? I think one of the problems, and we can look at this in a number of different organisations, livelihoods bizarrely ended up as a sector, as a sort of separate thing, as a department, as a budget area, as a profession, as a separate grouping of people and money, which was necessary to get these ideas institutionalised in large organisations, but actually ran completely counter to the whole idea. I remember sitting very recently in a discussion with colleagues from Oxfam who were saying, oh, well, yeah, we do a lot of livelihoods work in our projects, field projects, and our partners in field projects. Livelihoods thinking is really important, really helps our work there. But we can't use it in advocacy or in our broader work on sort of macro policy. And you hear this, if you have heard this in DFID and so on and so forth. But actually, why? Why? The reason is nothing to do with livelihoods thinking. In fact, quite the opposite. Local contextual understanding is rather useful, as we then explored for the particular cases that Oxfam were interested in at that time, around trade policy and so on. Surely that there is connections here. Surely that was the whole point. But no, it was because these were separate departments with separate line management and separate budgets and so on. It was an organisational phenomenon rather than an ideas phenomenon. But the mismatch between a complex, grounded idea that was cross-cutting and the way organisations work was something that we probably weren't effective at dealing with. And I think as a result, what emerged over this period, and I don't know whether this is reflected in the people in this room, was livelihoods tended to be then associated with field practitioners, field level training. I mean, I don't know whether that's a broad pattern of the membership of the Livelihoods Connect network as it's involved.
It's pretty good.
Yeah. Why was that? Why didn't macroeconomists, researchers even, people engaged in these bigger, broader debates, get engaged with this? Why did we, the community of practice, although rather like Robert, haven't been so engaged with it over this period, separated off into a separate grouping? Very unfortunate, I think, and a big failing of that community of practice. There was a sort of sense of comfortable, we do our local stuff, they do their stuff, we've got our budgets, they've got theirs, we've got our professional cadres, they've got theirs, and a separation off. As a consequence, I think, there has been a very fundamental failure, and why livelihoods thinking more broadly has been sidelined in mainstream development debates, which is probably how you can answer why not the World Bank, because that's mainstream with a capital M. Why has it failed to have purchase on fundamental debates about economic globalization, for example? In DFID, we had White Paper 2 in 2000, was it, or 1999? 2000. I did the word searches. Robert and I get into this slightly anal approach to word searching. But White Paper 1, 27 mentions of livelihoods or livelihood. White Paper 2, 3, I think. It disappeared. 3 years. 3 years in one organisation. Weird. And here was a white paper dealing with governance and globalisation. Surely rather linked to... But no, this was a different cadre. The White Paper 2 internally within DFID was known as the revenge of the economy. But actually there's a lot of work, there has been a lot of work on the links between local level context and broader processes of globalisation. Not well articulated, not well hooked into those debates. The other area is that livelihoods thinking has failed to engage with is around these broader debates about power, politics and governance. Again, substantially the focus of that second white paper, and indeed with a lot of work that's gone on in development studies since. Why did livelihoods fail to engage with those debates about governance? Well, it didn't, actually. And we dug out of a cupboard downstairs a huge amount of paper that was produced in the late, 2002, 3, thereabouts. Sabona Matisi at the back was involved in that project in Southern Africa, precisely applying the Sustainable Livelihoods approach to questions of governance, decentralisation, rights, etc., and broader questions of agrarian change. So actually there was a lot of work that had a sustainable livelihoods lens, but it didn't get into the governance field for those reasons that I've already mentioned. Third area, and these are all quite big areas, long-term secular environmental change, in particular climate change. There are lots of papers on livelihoods and, there are millions of papers on livelihoods and everything. Search Google, you'll find thousands of them. But did livelihoods thinking really contribute to debates about climate change as it evolved in the last 5 years or so? Bizarrely, no. If you look at a lot of that climate change literature now, it uses a lot of words about livelihoods and adaptation and so on, but not in a very sophisticated, what I would call sustainable livelihoods type of way. There's an appropriation of language, but actually not an appropriation of concepts and ideas. And I think that's a big missed opportunity. Climate change and environment in DFID, as many organisations now, is a separate bit, separate to livelihoods and so on. And despite the environment and development and sustainability heritage. And the final area that I think livelihoods thinking has failed to have purchase on or failed to engage with properly and should have done is understandings of long-term rural economic change. And again, this is kind of weird because a lot of the historical work that informed livelihoods thinking was exactly about long-term, both environmental and rural economic change. Think of all of the classic works of Mike Mortimer and Mary Tiffin and many people. Those are longitudinal studies of livelihoods and household and village change. Livelihoods has tended to become, because of those organisational and political reasons I talked about, associated with projects and implementation, not understanding how and why different trajectories of change at household, village and regional level are occurring, and how those changes actually do fundamentally affect livelihood opportunities and constraints. So our failure, and I do talk as somebody who's committed, if not very active in this community of practice, to engage with questions of economic globalisation, engage with questions of power, politics and governments, engage with climate change and long-term environmental change, and failure to engage with long-term change in rural economies, has meant the default, inevitably, has been the preferred approach to analysis is macroeconomics, with its attention, with its narrow framing and aggregate broad analysis, without attention, what livelihoods brought, to place, context and people. And you just have to look at the growth agenda in agriculture or the growth agenda in anything else, in any of these big agencies, and much of the academic literature. Indeed, we, and again I'm talking collectively here, we have ceded the opportunity that we had to make this context-based, place-specific and people-orientated to another grouping of people, and lost out on that battle. we talked about that has been important through, that has happened in particular in the last period. And I think, when we look forward to challenges at the end of the day, it's around how to re-engage with those sort of issues.